January 8th, 1945. Eastern France, near the village of Kaisersberg. Hill 616. The snow was thick, cold enough to bite through cloth. Jimmy Cartwright's fingers were numb, his breath sharp in his lungs. Just ahead, the hill loomed, Hill 616. Its slopes pocked with blackened craters and dying echoes of gunfire. From the top, the rattling thunder of a German machine gun cut through the air, rhythmically, like a deadly metronome. He could see the bodies of his fellow soldiers strewn across the white, their helmets rolled away, rifles frozen in useless angles. Somebody screamed out, "We need suppressive fire! Where's the grenadier?" No one answered. No one moved. Every head was down, every back pressed to the snow, pinned by fear, and by that gun nest on the ridge. Jimmy wasn't supposed to be here. He was the cook, the kitchen boy, the one who peeled potatoes and handed out rations, not grenades. Just 3 weeks ago, Sergeant Lindell had laughed and called him Chef Boyardee when he offered to carry ammo to the front. But now the sergeant was bleeding out in a ditch 50 yards back, and no one else was coming. Jimmy looked down at his shaking hands. One held an old M1 carbine rifle with a cracked stock. The other, a kitchen knife, 12 inches long, carbon steel, the handle worn smooth from use. He didn't say a word. He just pulled the white mattress cover tighter around his shoulders like a cloak, lowered his head into the wind, and started crawling toward the hill, toward the gunfire. They had all laughed at the kitchen boy, but no one would be laughing in 5 minutes. More than a mess boy. 3 weeks earlier. Back at the staging camp near Nancy, France, Private James Cartwright was peeling potatoes behind a mess tent. He wasn't angry about it. In fact, he was good at it. Before the war, he worked in his family's diner outside Columbus, Ohio. 6 stools, 1 grill, and a mother who ran the register like a general. He'd always figured he'd end up behind a stove, not a rifle. But after Pearl Harbor, he'd enlisted like everyone else, wanting to do his part. And like many men from small towns, the Army took one look at his background and stamped him mess section. That was how Jimmy Cartwright became the cook for Company Was, 30th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. Not a machine gunner, not a rifleman, just the kitchen boy. To the others, he was harmless, cheerful, useful maybe, but not one of them. They called him Potato Pope, Can Opener, or Chef Boyardee. None of it was cruel, but none of it was respect either. He tried to prove himself, volunteered for supply runs, carried hot food to foxholes under shell fire, offered to load ammunition. But no matter what, he always ended up back with the pots and pans. In letters home, he didn't mention the jokes, just wrote about how cold it was, how the coffee froze before you could drink it, how the men seemed to shrink in their uniforms the longer the campaign dragged on, how the war aged boys faster than time. By early January, the front had moved to the Alsace region, into the snow-choked Vosges Mountains. German forces had dug in deep, and rumors spread about hardened SS units and ambushes around every ridge. Company I was tasked with taking a small hill near Kaisersberg, Hill 616. Most assumed it would be a routine advance. Jimmy wasn't even supposed to be there that day. He had begged to join the column just to carry supplies, just to be near the front, just to prove he wasn't made of kitchen grease and tin cans. They let him come, but no one expected much. No one expected that, within hours, The cook would be the last man moving forward. Up the hill, down in the mud. The first time Jimmy saw Hill 616, it didn't look like much. Just a white hump in the distance, rising maybe 200 feet above the snow-covered forest line near Kaisersburg. From a map, it was a coordinate. From the ground, it looked more like a grave than a military objective. The night before the attack, Jimmy helped serve a thin stew to the men of Company 6. He moved down the line with a dented ladle, pouring into each tin cup, getting a few grunts of thanks, but mostly silence. It was cold, the kind of cold that stuck to your ribs and made even simple conversation feel like effort. At the end of the line, Sergeant Lindell lit a cigarette with one shaking hand and said, "You should have stayed back in the kitchen, Cartwright." Jimmy smiled like he always did. "Figured you boys needed a hot meal more than a hothead." Someone behind him chuckled. "He'll throw carrots at the Krauts." The men laughed, but there was tension under it, the kind of humor that leaks out before something bad happens. By dawn, the advance began. Jimmy was given permission to carry extra canteens and rations, as well as spare ammo belts. "Just follow the line. Stay low," someone said. "If shooting starts, you get down and pray." At first, everything was quiet. They moved up through pine trees, the air still, the snow crunching beneath boots. Jimmy stayed near the rear third of the company, between two rifle squads. Every few minutes, he glanced up at the hill, trying to gauge how far they had to go. Then came the first shot. A single pop, then a scream. Then the hammering of machine gun fire, short bursts that turned into long, angry buzzes. It came from above, from the hill's crest. Muzzle flashes flickered like lightning through the trees. Someone shouted, "MG 42," and men dropped to the snow. The Germans had waited until Company 1 was fully exposed before opening up. Jimmy hit the ground. He watched as men scrambled for cover, some not fast enough. A private he had served soup to just 12 hours earlier clutched at his neck, blood steaming in the cold. Officers yelled for flanking positions, for mortarmen, for medics. Nothing moved fast enough. The slope of Hill 616 was open, bare of trees. Every attempt to push forward ended in casualties. The snow worked against them. Movement was slow, obvious, and the Germans had the high ground. For hours, the company tried to maneuver. Jimmy helped drag a wounded man to safety, tore part of his undershirt to make a bandage, then ducked behind a small rise in the snow where half a dozen others were catching their breath. That's where he found himself next to Sergeant Lindell again, except this time the sergeant was on the ground, his leg torn open, face pale and shaking. Jimmy knelt beside him, ignoring the gunfire overhead. "I thought I told you to stay in the back," the sergeant muttered through clenched teeth. Jimmy tried to laugh. "Well, sir, the view up here's better." Lindell tried to grin, then winced. "They've got us pinned. 3 nests. 1 to the right, 2 dead center. No cover. We're sitting ducks." Jimmy peeked over the ridge. That was when he saw it. To the far left, a stretch of uneven terrain. A shallow depression, half concealed by broken shrubs and ice, possibly a flank route. It wouldn't take him to the top, but close. Close enough, maybe. Close enough for a crazy person with nothing to lose. He ducked back down. The others were low, scared, one soldier whispering a prayer. Jimmy opened his pack. Inside were 2 grenades he'd been given, just in case. He double-checked them. Then he reached into his belt and pulled out his kitchen knife, A long carbon steel blade with a wooden handle, the only personal thing he still carried from home. He looked at Lindell. "Permission to try something stupid, sir?" Lindell blinked, half delirious. "Are you armed?" "I've got a carbine and a butter knife." The sergeant's eyes softened. "Don't die, Cartwright." Jimmy nodded. He grabbed a mattress cover, the same one he'd used to sleep on the night before, and draped it around his shoulders, tucking it into his jacket. Against the snow, it might buy him a few seconds of invisibility. Not much, but maybe enough. He started crawling, low and slow, through the depression. The snow stung his wrists, ice soaked his sleeves. He moved inch by inch, clenching his jaw every time a machine gun spat over his head. He didn't think about the Germans. He thought about the diner back home, about his mom behind the register, about whether anyone would tell her how he died, and whether they'd mention the knife. As he neared the first ridge, he spotted the nest. Sandbags, camouflage netting, and 2 German gunners rotating fields of fire. He was within 30 yards, the grenade's range. He clutched the cold metal in his palm, took one deep breath, and threw. The explosion ripped through the snow. One German screamed. The other tried to raise his weapon, but Jimmy was already running, slipping, falling, rising again, charging with the carbine in one hand and the knife in the other. He didn't feel heroic. He felt cold, terrified, furious, and alive. The knife, the snow, and the nest. Jimmy's boots slipped as he scrambled over the ridge. The snow was slick with dirt and smoke now, churned up by the grenade blast. One of the Germans had been flung clear. His helmet rolled away, body twisted in the snow. The other was slumped against the sandbags, eyes wide open but unmoving. The third was nowhere to be seen. Jimmy didn't stop to check. He vaulted into the enemy nest like a man possessed, ducked behind the sandbags, and scanned the surroundings. Bullets cracked through the air above. Shouts echoed across the hillside in German and English. But here, in this small hollow, in the heart of the enemy's teeth, it was suddenly, eerily, quiet. He pressed his back to the cold earth wall, heart hammering, trying to catch his breath. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the fear that hadn't had time to settle until now. Then he heard it. A rustle. He turned. From the corner of the nest, a figure lunged. A young German soldier, barely older than Jimmy, dirt smeared across his face, eyes wide with panic. The barrel of a submachine gun rose between them. Jimmy reacted on instinct. He shoved forward, the kitchen knife leading. The blade caught the soldier just beneath the ribs. A soft, sickening sound that Jimmy would remember for the rest of his life. The German collapsed into him, eyes fluttering. Jimmy lowered him gently to the ground. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt sick. The snow was red now, Jimmy's hands red. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. He hadn't planned to survive this. And yet, here he was, one gun nest down, but 2 more to go. He grabbed the submachine gun, checked the magazine, and climbed out of the nest. His movements were no longer slow and cautious. They were fast, sharp, the way you move when you've already seen death and decided not to wait. Foul. The second gun nest was 100 yards uphill, partially hidden behind a rock outcropping. Jimmy stayed low, using every bush, every trench of snow as cover. He didn't think about the bullets zipping past. He didn't think about the soldiers screaming behind him. He didn't even think about his own body, which was starting to ache from exhaustion and adrenaline withdrawal. He just kept moving. At 70 yards, he crawled. At 50, He paused, pulled the pin from the second grenade. He whispered under his breath, "For Billy." Then he threw. The grenade landed just short, but the blast knocked one gunner off balance. Jimmy sprinted the rest of the way, gun raised, firing in bursts. The other German soldier turned too late. 2 short pops, and he dropped. Jimmy reached the second nest, breathing like a wild animal. Blood pounded in his ears. His shoulder burned. He'd been grazed. But he couldn't stop now. He saw one of the Germans still alive, crawling for a pistol. Jimmy kicked it away. The man raised his hands, surrender. Jimmy stared at him for a moment, unsure what to do. Then he waved the man toward the American lines with the barrel of the gun. "Go," he said in English. The German didn't move. "Go," Jimmy barked, and the soldiers scrambled down the hill, slipping and sliding through the snow, hands still in the air. The second nest was his, but the third was the worst. It was dug into a narrow ridge near the summit, with the best angle of fire, the highest visibility, and no doubt the most experienced crew. As Jimmy made his way toward it, his pace slowed. He was bleeding now, not just from the graze, but a deep cut along his thigh, maybe from a branch, maybe from shrapnel. Every step stung. His breath came in short, desperate gasps. And still, he climbed. The hill felt endless. He thought about his mother again, about how she'd told him once, when he was 8 years old and scared to dive off the high board at the pool. "Jimmy, courage isn't what you feel. It's what you do next." He repeated that sentence in his head with every step. Courage isn't what you feel. It's what you do next. When he reached the final nest, he was too tired to be scared. He waited until one of the gunners turned to reload, then launched himself forward. There was no time for finesse, no more grenades, no backup, just raw momentum. Jimmy crashed into the nest, tackled the gunner, and wrestled him to the ground. The other German scrambled for his weapon, but Jimmy's elbow connected first, a dull crack of bone on bone. Somewhere behind him, someone shouted in English. Backup was arriving. But the fight wasn't over. The first gunner kicked Jimmy off, drew a knife. They clashed in the snow, slipping, slashing, breath visible in sharp bursts. Jimmy's fingers found the hilt of his own knife, still smeared with blood from the first nest. Steel met steel. Then, with one final surge, Jimmy drove the blade forward. And it was done. He collapsed beside the sandbags, chest heaving, limbs shaking. The machine gun was silent. So was the hill. And then, the impossible. Cheers. Faint at first, then louder. From below, the Americans were moving up. They had seen the final nest fall. The line was advancing. The hill was theirs. Someone reached Jimmy, grabbed his shoulder. A medic. "You okay, buddy?" Jimmy tried to speak, but only coughed. The medic looked at his face. "Jesus, you're the cook." Jimmy managed a nod. "The damn cook took the hill," someone shouted. And then he passed out. The quiet after the storm. When Jimmy woke up, everything was white. At first he thought he was dead. The ceiling above him was canvas. His body ached. His arm was bandaged. His thigh stitched. The air smelled like iodine and tobacco. Somewhere nearby, a typewriter clacked and boots crunched on frozen dirt. It was a field hospital, 2 miles behind the new line. A nurse leaned over him. "You're awake." Jimmy tried to speak, but his throat was dry. The nurse offered him water. "Cartwright, right?" she said softly. "You've got quite the reputation now." He blinked at her. "They're calling you the Kitchen Commando." That name would follow him for the rest of his life. Over the next 2 days, a stream of officers came by his cot. Some he knew, most he didn't. They all said variations of the same thing. You did what needed doing. Brave damn thing. Hell of a move, son. Even Sergeant Lindell hobbled in on crutches, his leg still bandaged. Couldn't let the cook show us all up, he said with a grin. Jimmy tried to smile, but it didn't come easy. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, heavy, like he'd left something of himself back on that hill, buried in the snow with the men he couldn't save. No one talked about Billy, or the others. But Jimmy remembered. He remembered the sound Billy made when he fell, the way he grabbed at the air, as if reaching for someone to hold on to, the silence that followed. He remembered the German boy in the first nest, the way his eyes fluttered when the knife went in, how he didn't scream, just looked surprised. And he remembered the blood on the snow, red and steaming, fading slowly into white as the cold took over. The medal came a week later, Bronze Star. It was handed to him by a colonel who read the citation aloud in a stiff voice. There were a few claps. Someone whistled. The ceremony lasted 5 minutes. Jimmy tucked the medal into his footlocker and didn't look at it again for months. After the war, Jimmy went home. Ohio hadn't changed much. The same streetlights, the same diner. His mother was older, but just as sharp. She hugged him for a full minute and cried into his coat. The town held a small parade. The local paper ran a photo. Local cook turns hero. But Jimmy didn't give interviews. He didn't tell stories. When people asked what it was like, he said, "Cold." He reopened the diner, changed the name. Hill 16, he called it, not 616, just 16. He never explained the number. Most assumed it was something about the war. He didn't correct them. The place did well. Soldiers came through, truckers, families. The pancakes were famous. The kitchen was spotless. On one wall, he hung the knife, the same one he carried up the hill, framed in wood, the blade still stained. Below it, a small plaque, property of the kitchen boy. No one asked questions, but they noticed. Jimmy never married, never left Ohio again. But he wrote letters to the families of the men who didn't make it. He visited graves. And once a year, on January 8th, he closed the diner and took a walk alone by the river. One day, years later, a young boy came into the diner with his father. He saw the knife and asked, "Did you really kill Germans with that?" Jimmy looked at the boy, thought for a moment. "No," he said softly. "I saved Americans with it." The boy didn't understand, but the father did, and he nodded. In his final years, Jimmy wrote one letter, never mailed, folded and placed inside a drawer. It read, "They called me a cook, a mess boy, said I didn't belong on the front. Maybe they were right, but when no one else went, I did. Not because I was brave, but because I couldn't stand still. I didn't fight for medals. I fought for the faces around me, for the guy who lent me socks, for the one who shared his chocolate, for the one who cried when no one was looking. I fought for them, and if that's all I ever did, it was enough." He signed it simply, James A. Cartwright, Private First Class, Company Y. The war inside every man. Hill 16 still stands today. Overgrown now, reclaimed by time and silence. The wind that whips across its slopes carries no gunfire, only the rustle of pine and the crunch of wandering hikers. The earth there has forgotten the blood once spilled into its roots. But some names, some stories, do not fade. James Cartwright was never famous. He never appeared in history books or documentaries. There are no statues of him, no streets named after his sacrifice. His name is etched quietly into a headstone behind a small churchyard in Columbus. James A. Cartwright, 1921 to 1989. Beloved son, loyal friend, faithful to the end. And yet, in that one frozen afternoon in January 1945, Jimmy Cartwright changed the fate of dozens of men. He did not hold rank. He did not lead from the front. He was not born for violence, trained for heroism, or molded by doctrine. He was a kitchen boy with a heart too big to stay behind. And that might be the most important lesson of all. Because war, real war, is not made up only of commanders and generals, of strategies drawn on maps and dates burned into textbooks. It is carried on the shoulders of the ordinary, the men who load boxes, who fill canteens, who sleep on mud, and cook for the hungry. And when the moment comes, it is often those men, overlooked, underestimated, uncelebrated, who do what no one expects. Courage, you see, isn't exclusive. It doesn't require permission. It isn't owned by medals or uniforms or even the right to be there. Courage is a choice, sometimes the last one you think you'll ever get to make. And Jimmy made his. He chose to crawl uphill through gunfire, carrying a kitchen knife and 2 grenades, not because he thought he could win, but because he couldn't watch his friends die while he did nothing. That is not reckless. That is not glory-seeking. That is love in its rawest form. Love expressed in action. There's another truth buried here, and it's one we don't always talk about, that even after the battle ends, the war continues, inside the men who lived through it. Jimmy went home, but he carried that hill with him for the rest of his life, not in his scars, but in his silence, in the way he closed the diner on January 8th, in the names he didn't say, the stories he never told, because survival is not the end of war. Sometimes it's just the beginning of remembering. And perhaps that's why his story matters so much now. Because in a time when we often measure people by their titles, their visibility, or how loudly they speak, Jimmy's life reminds us that greatness often whispers. It doesn't beg for recognition. It just shows up when it matters most. I think about Jimmy sometimes, though we never met. I think about the way he walked into gunfire carrying a kitchen knife, the way he turned ridicule into resolve, the way he never stopped serving, even when it wasn't his job. And it makes me wonder, how many Jimmy Cartwrights have we overlooked? How many people in our own lives are quietly carrying the weight, showing up without being asked, holding others up without fanfare? Sometimes we're so focused on the loudest voice in the room, we miss the ones doing the real work, the quiet heroes, the steady hands, the ones with calluses, not headlines. In Jimmy's story, we don't just find a tale of war, we find a blueprint for character, for the kind of courage that doesn't need to be seen, only felt. And now, I want to ask you something, not about war, not about history, but about life. When have you seen someone rise when no one expected them to? Who was the kitchen boy in your world? The one they laughed at until they didn't? Maybe it was you. If so, I hope this story reminded you. What people expect of you doesn't define you. What you choose to do in your hardest moment does. So let's end this, not with applause, but with memory. Remember, Jimmy, not because he won a hill, but because he showed us what one person can do, not when they're trained for it, but when their heart leaves them no other choice. What surprised you most about Jimmy's story? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it. Because maybe, just maybe, someone out there is still carrying their own hill. And they need to know they're not alone.